I'm going to walk you through what we are in the process of doing in terms of building an evidence base for energy poverty across Canada. Essentially, what we're doing is acquiring census data in a customized fashion. And I'm going to not assume that you're familiar with the terms I'm throwing at you. So we are looking at a data set that will cover the entire country, but down to pretty small geographies. So when we talk about an urban region, we're talking about a census metropolitan area. When we're talking about an urban municipality, we're going to talk about a census subdivision, or a CSD. And we'll also look at urban neighborhoods or census tracts. Because we're covering the whole country, we're also going to consider townships and counties that are outside of urban regions, so a census division. But the map will cover, an interactive map will cover all of Canada. So we're buying a data set for two purposes. One is to put some data into this map so you can look at it and work with it. But the other, and because it's going to be a very complex data table, it'll be made available to all of you as well as the team for additional in-depth analysis. And when I walk you through some of the elements of the table, you'll see how complex it is. We actually could generate easily hundreds of variables for every single neighborhood across Canada. So far beyond what we want to do in the life of this project, and certainly more complicated than you could throw into a single mapping tool. So next slide, please. So this table we're putting together is something that is not available through the community data program right now. In fact, the topic of energy poverty is new to the program. But what we are doing is building a table that, like I said, geographically is all about seeing life through the lens of a municipal decision maker. So we're not so much concerned with CMAs as we are about CSDs, which capture municipal boundaries very well. And then within a municipality, understanding some of the neighborhood dynamics. Households is referred to. So all the data sets that we're buying have to be structured as households. And that's problematic with some of the variables we're going to consider, because there is no such thing as a recent immigrant household. Nor is there a household you could construct simply out of commuting patterns. And I'll explain that a little more in a moment. So what you see here are 6 what are called dimensions. And a dimension is, you could say, a topic or a theme. And then the number in bracket after each dimension would be the number of variables associated with it. So home energy spending as a percentage after tax household income is essentially the energy burden. So there will be 7 variables for energy burden. I'm not going to go into all of these. There are easily 40 or 50 variables here. Just to make the point, I mean, we could share with you what they all are. I shared with Allison a much more detailed paper that goes with all of this. But essentially, we're trying to understand home energy spending in multiple ways. I'll get to each of those ways in a moment. Home energy expenditures has to do with the absolute dollar amount being spent on home energy. The income characteristics cover everything from median income at a neighborhood level to a number of low-income measures. So LIM, for those of you familiar with poverty measures, LIM, LICO, and MBM, or the market basket measure, are the standard ones. So we'll include all of them in this table. Housing tenure, which is, do you rent, own, do you live in subsidized housing, would be part of this. A number of housing characteristics, everything from the age of the house, of the dwelling, to the structure of the dwelling. Is it a single family? Is it a multi-story? Questions around housing affordability, core housing need. Again, this is the single biggest one, quite a few housing characteristics. And these, from Maryam's work, correlated very strongly with energy poverty. There was a close relationship between the type of housing you are in and the extent of energy poverty. And then finally, the household demographics. We have a number of measures that relate to things like immigrant status, visible minority status, commuting patterns. Again, all of these share one thing in common, almost all of these, which is that they're actually designed as persons. So you would have not, like I said before, not an immigrant household, but you have persons who've arrived in Canada within the past number of years. So we've actually have to construct a household concept out of these. And there is no right way or best way of constructing a household construct out of something that was intended to be persons. So they're all flawed in different ways. What will be important is the user understands what we're talking about when we refer to a household. So these are the elements of the multidimensional table. We will be taking this table, and when we receive it, we're going to have to convert it into a number of manageable files. So you can go to the next slide now. And out of this table, we will create about 25 indicators, which is a small subset of what we could be creating. And what we'll be doing these is taking each of those indicators and cross-tabulating it by the percentage of households spending 6% or more of their household income on home energy. And by cross-tabulate, what I mean is it's a difference between saying in this given neighborhood, 10% of households are spending more than 6% of their income on home energy. In addition, what we know about this neighborhood is that about 12% of households have incomes below the low-income measure. Cross-tabulating allows you to say that we know what percentage of low-income households are facing a high energy burden. So it's a much more specific and powerful indicator. So we're going to have all 25 of our indicators cross-tabulated in the mapping tool in this way. So if you go to the next slide, this is the list of the 25. These 25 are not set in stone, although we have been doing a lot of ruminating about are these the right ones. They're divided into about 8 topics or 7 topics. So I mentioned home energy affordability. That's a mix of what is the median amount of expenditure, household expenditure on home energy, again, at a neighborhood level, at a city level, at the CMA level as well. What is the median amount being spent across neighborhoods, across the city and across Canada? And then we've selected 5 different energy burden thresholds. The 6% was the one that Maryam was referring to. That's roughly twice the median, Canadian national median. But we have also some extreme energy burden, those households spending 15% or more of their income, as well as a very low energy burden, which is under 3%. So that's a cluster of indicators around home energy affordability. Out of the choice of couple of dozen housing indicators, we've selected this set that will appear in the mapping tool. And again, the intent here is that for every indicator, you could see what percentage, not just what percentage are in core housing need, but what percentage of households are in core housing need and spending more than 6% of their income on home energy. The demographics, these are the ones on the right are all constructs of measures that are designed to be individuals, persons, but are now going to be presented as households so you can cross-tabulate them against home energy poverty. So quite a bit of discussion we had about transportation and transportation energy burdens. So because we're working with the census, we are limited in what they can offer. So we actually can rely on 3 measures: how you get around as a commuter, so whether you're driving in a car, whether you're walking or cycling or using public transit, how far you're going, and the third one is how long it takes for you to get there. So we do have a number of transportation indicators available to us, and we've selected these 2 that would go into the mapping tool. So again, I won't go through all of these in detail. What we have in addition to this is a definition for each of these indicators, and we are prepared to go to Stats Canada tomorrow and start the process of acquiring this, but it could take at least a few weeks to sort this out. So these are the 25 indicators that will go into the mapping tool. And then what I'm going to show in the next few slides, these are not examples, you can move to the next slide, Allison. These are not examples of the actual mapping tool that is to be designed. This is some screen captures from an existing tool that was designed that's going to serve as our template, and so it just gives you visualizing a sense of what it is we're talking about here. So this is the city of Guelph, or a census subdivision, and what we intend to do is allow the user to click on a given municipality and then generate a list of the 25 indicators. You'd also have the choice of seeing the indicators cross-tabulated by energy poverty or just independently of energy poverty. You also would be able to potentially have to decide if we want to download data directly from the mapping tool or just make the file available to the members of the network. So in this case, we're looking at the percentage of the population that arrived in Canada within the past 10 years at the census subdivision level. So not surprisingly, there's a lot of blue in this part of the country. And again, this data would be, if you zoomed out, would be available for the whole country. at the CMA level, at least, all CMAs, all urban regions, census subdivisions within CMAs. So the next slide would be, if you want to drill a little deeper, you could go into a neighborhood or a census tract within, in this case, the city of Guelph. And what we will make available is a comparison tool. So this looks at neighboring census tracts and how they compare for the indicator you have selected. You can also view, again, all 25 indicators for a given census tract. And finally, if you want to look outside of an urban region or a CMA, you have the option of getting a profile, what we're calling a community profile of a census division, which is either an upper tier municipality, a county, or a township located outside of urban regions. So again, just a list of 25 indicators chosen either as cross-tabulated or not cross-tabulated by energy poverty for any census division anywhere in Canada. And there'll be some other features. Again, the paper I sent to Allison gives a little more detail on all the other features. One of them is that this tool will be available in either official language, and there'll also be a search feature, so you can find a municipality or a neighborhood or a place more easily without zooming in and out. So you can move to the next slide. I looked at a lot of the questions and comments that are provided by yourselves and your colleagues in other municipalities, and I just wanted to respond to three big questions that came up. One was an expressed desire to look not just at socioeconomic characteristics, but be able to cross-tabulate them by energy poverty. And as I would have just shown, quite a few of the specific variables that were cited, we will be cross-tabulating by energy poverty. So if you want to look at the map and you want to look at renters who are facing a high energy burden, you can do that. So there are, actually, I would say most of the socioeconomic variables that were cited are now going to be cross-tabulated. The only difficulty that I mentioned is when you're cross-tabulating something like commuting patterns or immigrant families. There are no household constructs for these. I just repeat again, we did have to create a household construct. They'll also be able to look at a neighborhood based on just the number of persons commuting by car, and then separately for that same neighborhood, what percentage of households in that neighborhood have a high energy burden. That's another way of comparing it, but we have created constructs for each of these. There are also, because we're looking at the census only, a number of variables that we cannot measure. One of them is the source of energy in terms of home energy use. So the census includes two big categories of home energy. One is electricity, and a second is all others. And the others include natural gas, oil, wood, and things like propane. But because natural gas is lumped in with oil and a bunch of others, it's not really a helpful way to look at source of energy. So we can't really distinguish what energy source a particular set of households in a given neighborhood are consuming, but we can certainly talk about energy expenditures. And then the related issue is around transportation. So the census does have a whole section on transportation, but it relates to commuting patterns. And there are two consequences of that. One is that we are talking about people who are in the labor force, actively in the labor force. So we know nothing about children, we know nothing about seniors who are no longer in the labor force. We only know information about people who are commuting to work. So the data we get from the census is just how you get from home to work on a typical day in May during the census year. The other limitation is that this is all about, well, it's not about expenditures. We know nothing about how much an individual or household are spending on transportation. What we know is how you got to work, how far you traveled, and how quickly it took you to get there. So these are not indicators of energy poverty, but we will look at these commuting indicators. They do have some value in their own right. Certainly if a neighborhood is characterized overwhelmingly by households where there's at least one person who's driving a car a very long distance on a regular basis to work, as opposed to a neighborhood characterized overwhelmingly by individuals walking short distances to work, that presumably is a reflection or an indicator of energy poverty, but on its own it doesn't capture the essence of an energy burden. And then thirdly, if you want to go to the next slide, there were a set of questions about how can we identify specific neighborhoods that may be facing a high energy burden. So this is something we hadn't considered with the original design of the mapping tool. So we've agreed to add another feature to it, which is before you get to the mapping tool itself, we'll have a sort of a dashboarding feature where you can do a query and report that will rank neighborhoods or municipalities within a given census metropolitan area in terms of their relative energy burden. So you could have a list, if you go to the city of Saskatoon, you could have a list of every single census tract in Saskatoon ranked by the number or percentage of households spending more than, say, 15% or 10% or 6%. You could choose which burden you want to work with, that have that energy burden, just a rank from top to bottom, and then be able to move from that ranking directly to a given neighborhood. So if you're trying to identify the top 10 neighborhoods that have the highest energy burden, you can use this tool to then take you to the mapping tool and then develop a profile of those neighborhoods. So that's something that would make it a lot easier to identify, to make sense of this what will be a sea of color, so red, green, and yellow, to actually zoom in and understand through this query or report feature what constitutes a vulnerable neighborhood. I guess so that there were other questions that came up in the feedback, but those were, I guess, 3 themes that came up. So I mentioned a lot of the data originally was going to be coming right out of the community data program repository, but in the end, because the program hasn't focused on energy poverty specifically, we are going to be building this really exciting multi-dimensional data table that will be brought into this project and will be useful not just for the mapping tool, but for a lot of other analysis, hopefully not just during the life of this project, but beyond. So that is what we're doing in building this evidence base for this project.